You have people who are running the public arts now who are much more interested in the skin colour or the race or the sexual orientation of artists rather than what the artists actually make. And so if you don't fall into one of those favoured categories, you find yourself quite limited. And in effect, you find yourself shut out of a lot of the lines of funding, lines of recognition. So you don't get invited to join the Royal Academy, you don't get work purchased by major museums.
Alexander Adams says the progressive takeover of the art world is so complete that artists who don't follow the woke agenda need a new movement.
We need to start again. We need to start with new places, new galleries, new patrons. And what I say to young artists coming up now is don't worry about the Tate Gallery, because the Tate Gallery has turned its back on you already.
He talks about attacks on public art and why we should treasure beauty.
A lot of those figures, they had an inherent dignity. And when you saw the protesters disfiguring them, painting them up, or scratching them, or even sort of knocking off limbs or knocking off the head, I think it displays an inherent violence and malice and dysfunction in the people who are doing it and the people who encourage it. I think it's unhealthy.
Alexander says to get beyond these culture wars, artists need to look inwards and improve themselves.
That comes from stopping blaming other people. You start to tell the truth about yourself and you say, I didn't get all of the opportunities that I could have done because of my own mistakes. It wasn't just the director of the so-and-so gallery turning down my exhibition. It wasn't just patron X or local council Y refusing to buy my work. I made some mistakes too.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm delighted to welcome back artist and author Alexander Adams. Alexander, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me back.
Your new book is out, How to Start a Dissident Art Movement. An excellent read, I thought. Before we dive into that, can you kind of set the scene for us? What is the art scene like now? Why are we talking about starting a dissident movement?
Well, I think it's just a question of a lot of artists, if they'd been born 10 or 15 years earlier, have found themselves locked out because of politics or because of demographics. So you have people who are running the public arts now who are much more interested in the skin colour or the race or the sexual orientation of artists rather than what the artists actually make. And so if you don't fall into one of those favoured categories, you find yourself quite limited. And in effect, you find yourself shut out of a lot of the lines of funding, lines of recognition. So you don't get invited to join the Royal Academy, you don't get work purchased by major museums, you don't get the solo or group exhibitions that you would have expected if you'd been born just a few years earlier and you'd already been established. So what's happened is artists have said, well, we can't spend our time worrying about the things that have been taken from us or the opportunities that are denied us because they're not going to get offered to us. So we need to start again. We need to start with new places, new galleries, new patrons. And what I say to young artists coming up now is don't worry about the Tate Gallery because the Tate Gallery has turned its back on you already. So it's time for you to start thinking about the future and start thinking about making work that's going to be exhibited in museums that are not yet built.
We're seeing a lot of people now feeling kind of disrespected by this elite, like ruling class, if you like. Feel their ideas are belittled, they're referred to as far right or whatever. And those people are kind of finding a voice. We're seeing like the big parade, for example, the protests. Yeah. Are we seeing that reflected in the art world, would you say?
On a quieter scale, I think, weirdly, you'd think that artists would be a lot more rebellious and independent, but actually a lot of them are talking behind the scenes. They're saying, well, I don't agree with this policy. I think the government's nonsense. I don't think that politicians of any party at the moment, any major party at all, are taking the subject seriously. But they're a bit reluctant to speak out because the arts are predominantly dominated by liberals, by progressives, by people who are on the political left. And so even though they themselves may find that they are more conservative, or they simply don't take the same side as the administrators, they feel cautious, and it's only slowly working its way through. There are a few of us of my age and slightly younger. Actually, a lot of them are youngsters. A lot of them are quite a bit younger than me. And it's really nice to see this sort of growing excitement amongst people who are in their 20s about what they can do for themselves, because they know that they're not going to get the hand up that their parents or their grandparents would have got if they had been artists.
So in what the left or progressivism or whatever has done to art, if you spend your time fighting against that, all your energy will be expended on that. So what you're talking about really is creating something new. What will this movement be? What will its values be? What does it want to achieve?
I would say that a lot of the values of the artists of the future will be very similar to those values that came before, well, even the 1960s or so on. There would have been just sort of historically centrist. I think that someone that people talk about is Julius Evola, and Julius Evola said that he was criticised as being far right, but he said, well, actually, my views are simply those that every educated gentleman of the preceding 20 centuries would have had. So I think it's better for us to think of today's politics in terms of an aberration. And a lot of the artists who are coming up now, I would say that they're not specifically political in outlook, but what they're doing is they want to talk about truth. And for me, truth is talking about eternal qualities, about difference, about inequalities. So the mantra of today in the art world, in the establishment, is that everyone's equal. Well, we know that people aren't equal. We know that people are born with different levels of talent, of different levels of interest, of ability, of height, of intelligence, of aptitude for all sorts of things. And that's only perfectly normal. It's only insects that are born equal. So you want to talk about the inequalities and the differences between men and women, and not in a sort of, oh, we're better than you way, but in a sort of, isn't this interesting? Or I'm excited by the differences between people, the differences between cultures. And that's an exciting thing. And when you start celebrating cultures for what they are and not actually just trying to say, well, actually, they're all equal. No, they're not all equal. Some have good qualities and bad qualities, and often they have, even the cultures that you're not from, you recognise that they have good qualities that are different from those of your own. So there's lots to talk about, and I think it's just in terms of eternal truths rather than political points.
So you're not saying let's copy what was done 100 years ago, but it's more about not copying what is being done now.
Yeah, so this is something that we have this little discussion on the right about whether sort of non-left-wing art, non-state art should be traditional. Should it be traditional in form? Or I would say perhaps not. I don't think it should be. I don't think it should look like the art of 100 years ago, because our society doesn't look like that. Yeah. And even though you may want to have some of those old values, for example, you might believe in chivalric values or romantic values from the medieval period, and you might be excited by sort of epics like that. I think painting those things directly and translating them literally is not really going to work. I don't think that's the way that we think. It's not the way that we've been raised. It's not the way that we see things. A lot of symbolism in the past really worked because the educated people, the tastemakers, the people who were buying the work and commissioning the work, they really understood the language of symbols. That's not quite the same today, so I think you have to paint in a different way. So what I would say is, don't get caught up on the tradition of form, so realistic painting, knights in armour, women sort of collecting fruit and so forth, which are all perfectly pleasant. But I would say become attached to form in spirit. And that spirit may take many different forms. It may take a modern form, may take a conceptual form, it may take an abstract form. So think about tradition as spirit rather than tradition as form. And I think that that's the way forward for the most lively, intelligent and ambitious artists. They're going to pick those things up. Not to say that the traditionalists are not intelligent or capable in their own way, but I don't think that they're painting work that will be viewed in centuries to come as the most exciting of our time. The most exciting art of our time is really going to be quite unexpected and powerful and not at all sort of traditional in form.
If we look at that kind of traditional art, we can feel often the virtues of the artists that created it. Do you think that still has a place in art produced now? I mean, we see a lot of virtue signalling, but not so much the virtues.
Yes, I would say that what you need is people who are seriously engaging with their values, and that can be, to do with honesty to materials, honesty to your society. It may even mean recording the things about society that you disapprove of. So, for example, I've painted lots of pictures of nudes, and some of these nudes are not classical. They're a little bit modern. They're set in modern times. They're set in modern clothing. There's modern furniture around them. You see a mobile phone on the table. You see an ashtray on the floor. In some ways, it's quite shocking because you compare those to classical landscapes and the traditionalist nudes that you see from some people who are of a conservative perspective at the moment. And my work looks a little bit shocking. It looks a bit unexpected. But what I want to do is to create new modern pictures in the style of something like Degas or Sickert, who were painters at the end of the 19th century. Make something as exciting and raw and powerful as that, but set it in our own time. And I think that actually brings along and extends the tradition and it extends the traditional values of being honest and looking at things and not flinching from things that might be a little bit weird or distasteful. And that extends the traditional values, but without being traditional in form.
So we're talking about art reflecting society now rather than hundreds of years ago.
Absolutely, yeah. So what we want to produce some work. Often I feel that some work that is reactionary is actually afraid of today. It's afraid of doing anything that looks like today. It's sort of, you're not going to include a motorway in the landscape because you don't approve of it. Well, fair enough. But I would say include the motorway in the landscape and maybe allow people to reflect on whether or not they like that being there, whether or not they approve of it, whether they think that that's car use is a good thing, or whether the landscape should be protected and that sort of thing should be concealed. So present this and allow people to think about it rather than hiding it and running away from it. I think the braver you are, the stronger work you make, and also I think the more that history will appreciate what you're doing.
What things does an art movement like this need, apart from obviously functioning artists?
Well, it needs patrons. It needs money because in order to have art made, you need patrons. Now, a lot of artists are raised in the sort of romantic liberal idea that talking about money is a bad thing. And I agree, I don't want to talk about money, but money is needed. So recently I was writing a little book on Leonardo da Vinci. And Leonardo da Vinci was at the behest of the Pope, of the Medicis, of the different patrons, princes and cardinals and popes and so forth. Ended up in France as a guest of the King of France. And he was following the money, and he was often having to do work that was closely related to what his patrons wanted.
Right.
But that didn't stop him from producing some of the most sublime works of art. So we need patrons, we need venues, so that means commercial galleries. Eventually it will mean museums, but today we just need commercial galleries that are willing to exhibit our work and say, this is some new art, this is the sort of thing you're not going to find in museums. We also need publications, so we need maybe a good art publication as well as stuff that happens online. I know a lot happens online, but it would be nice to get something in print as well. So all sorts of things, and even more intangible things like sort of the salon culture, that the great modernist movements of Vienna and Paris, they had their hangouts, they had their favourite cafes,
right.
they had their restaurants, they had their the places where they all went on holiday and so forth. And what it would be great is that if we could establish a sort of an informal sort of network of these sort of places where dissident artists, or at least dissenting artists, could go and make connections between themselves, between patrons, between them and students,
So non-artists would go there because they might see an artist there.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So you used to have people turning up at the cafes in Paris to see if Picasso was there or to see if Giacometti was there. And there was a real sense of excitement of wanting to be in touch with these people because they were so exciting and so admired. And it would be lovely to have just a touch of that happen on our side of things. And so I think that will naturally happen, but we need the galleries to exhibit the art so that people buy it and it becomes published. And so there's a whole ecosystem that needs to evolve around what's going on. It's not just a question of a few artists. There's a lot of things that people could do just simply by buying books or buying relatively cheap pictures, because you can buy prints by artists that I know for £50, $50. You can really start at a low level, and so it doesn't take very much, and all we need is a bit more commitment like that, and it will really start to change things.
So it sounds like the funding is obviously a big thing. Are things happening in that? Because it feels like the art world is so stacked on the other side.
There are things that are happening. We're constantly in talks with people who have money, people who want to invest a little bit, people who want to buy pictures. It's really tricky because what you're doing is you're operating in an environment where not your opponents, but the people who have most of the attention and the limelight, that they're being directly funded by the state. So, for example, the Arts Council puts in, I think it's over £500 million a year.
Wow.
Into all sorts of things. And now some of that is relatively apolitical, some of it's historical. You've got Shakespeare, you've got the National Gallery and so forth. There's lots of stuff there that wouldn't be classed as sort of activist art.
Although if you go and try and watch Shakespeare at the Globe, a lot of it feels activist.
Yes, there are lots of productions that have a political feel to them. But so the problem is that we need, I think that more grassroots funding, so sort of maybe even crowdsourcing. So this is something that I've discussed with some of the other artists that I've been working with, the idea about, well, we could crowdsource having an exhibition, or we could crowdsource a printed catalogue. And this would be like any other crowdsource thing where people publish a book or a comic book, or they want to fund a film or something. So it'd be anything like that, and you just do that for what we do. It takes a bit of organising, but we've also got some organisers who are willing to support us as well as the creative guys.
One interesting chapter in your book is about the Barbican. Can you talk to us through why that example is important?
Yeah, the Barbican is an art centre that's based in the City of London, and it was established after the Second World War. It was actually built largely over the 70s, I think opened in the early 1980s. And that's a really interesting example because it's a residential complex. It's an arts centre. It's got theatres, it's got recital halls, it's got spaces for conferences, it's got an exhibition space, it's got a library. It's a very really exciting hub. Architecturally, it's controversial, of course. It's brutalist, yeah. But what's interesting about that is it's not funded directly by the state. It's funded by the City of London, by the Corporation of London.
Right.
So there's money coming in from backers who are not state funded and they are not state aligned. So theoretically, they could be doing something really interesting and independent. In effect, they are lining up a little bit with the state art, a little bit with the Arts Council. And I think, well, there's no reason for them to do that. They're not getting any money directly from the Arts Council. We could maybe set up something like that on a smaller scale for ourselves, that does cinema shows, that does exhibitions, that does classes, that puts on theatre performances, musical performances. That would be terrific. And so my discussion about this theoretical-based Barbican, which is a chapter in the book, really explores the idea of, could we set up a dissident arts centre, an arts centre that's independent? And I say, if you're careful about it, if you think about it hard, and you concentrate and you don't allow yourself to be diverted, I think it's possible to do something like that on a small scale.
Do you think the establishment that exists now will react if you try and kind of push this movement forward?
Yes. We've already had all sorts of people smearing us, as sort of, right wing or sort of whatever. And and some of us are right wing, some of us are sort of libertarian. There are some of us who are just sort of like really just pushing back against the idea of art as a social tool for cohesion or for wellness or mental health, which is a lot of what the government's trying to do. It's trying to fold in the fine arts and try and use them in an instrumental way. So we've had quite a bit of pushback already. I think the best thing for us to do is just to carry on as we are, talking to our audience, talking to people online, setting up exhibitions, holding those shows and publishing our ideas, our essays, having interviews like this, and carry on reaching out to people. And I think that the more people hear about what we're doing and what we're saying, they'll see that, well, you're not actually extremists. You've actually hold sort of views that are relatively conventional, especially, you go back 20, even 30 years ago, the views you held, the views we hold are actually quite conventional and unremarkable. And we don't actually want to talk about politics at all. We just want to get on and paint our pictures and sculpt statues and write plays and stuff and just get really excited and interested in the subjects that we're interested in. And I don't think any of us are really out to proselytise or, to convert anyone to a political party.
You've mentioned several times about the state funding. And can you help our viewers understand a bit how big of an issue this is and what control it has over the art world?
Yeah, so I bought into, so I'm 50, what am I now? I'm 53. So when I was at university, which was from 92 to 95, I was taught about a system, an informal system, that was essentially set up from the 1950s onwards, and which operated in the following way. So you would go to art school, you would get your degree, you would perhaps do further work, you'd maybe do some teaching work, you'd do exhibitions, you'd go into sort of slightly state subsidised studios in large buildings, sort of converted warehouses, and that would be sort of favourably zoned so that you weren't paying business rates. Right. So there's a little subsidy. You'd start off, you do some group exhibitions at your local arts centre funded by the local council. And maybe if you were lucky, then you'd get a review in Art Monthly. Art Monthly gets a yearly subsidy from the Arts Council. So that's a magazine which is essentially funded by the Arts Council, by central government. Then you'd step up to museums. Then you'd perhaps go get your work bought by the Government Art Council. Again, taxpayers' money, buying pictures to put in the offices of diplomats or politicians. Then you'd step up at the highest level, you'd get exhibited at the Tate Gallery, which gets a direct funding from the government. And then maybe if you were super famous, so if you were sort of Anthony Gormley or Anish Kapoor, then you'd get picked up by the British Council and you'd have an exhibition that would tour the world. The British Council is basically the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office is a soft power diplomacy department. Right. And they organise cultural events around the world. So there you are, the British Council would be funding you at the highest level. So at all of those levels, there's some degree of public financing, either through the Arts Council, local council, the national government, or even sort of zoning or taxation. And all of those contribute to the success or the prosperity or the viability of an artist's career. And when I went into that, that was pretty much established. And then what happened was identity politics came in, left-wing politics came in a big way. and that kind of cut the legs out. So you were denied the whole of that system, basically. And that's why we have to form a dissident art movement, because basically we're not getting subsidised at all.
So the idea of that prearranged path that you're taught about is kind of good in a sense that it gets artists out into the world. It's only when, as you say, the identity politics comes in, or any form of kind of political influence, that it starts to become a not so positive thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that level, as we talked about, the level of funding is really important for any artists, because there are not many who come from well-to-do backgrounds. So yeah, we want to direct funding into those. We want to support the artists that we think are really great who don't get opportunities. So we'd like them to get a sort of residencies. We'd like them to get exhibitions. We'd like work to get purchased and then sort of donated to local communities, or we'd like someone to commission a sculpture by a really great sculptor and have that in a public space. Yes, of course, we'd love to sort of direct our own funding there. So we're not sort of insane libertarian sort of capitalist sort of, anti-commerce. No, money is necessary. It's not going away. So we'd like to obviously just sort of spread it around so there's an opportunity for us to operate independently and have our own lines of funding, which are obviously the alternative ones to the state ones, which are denied to us.
I wanted to ask you a bit about statues. So you talk about this in the book. Statues have always been important in public life in Britain, well, for a long time anyway. They used to be to commemorate someone who's achieved great things, but it seems in recent times they're being used in different ways. We see some unusual statues in places like Trafalgar Square. We see Black Lives Matter toppling statues to make their statements. What role do statues play in our culture?
Well, when I started out, everyone had gripes about the Marxists, because the Marxists would say, because the Marxists were our teachers and we read them at college, it was required reading and it was useful to read. And they said, well, art is all about power. It's all about the hegemony, sort of. It's a power group exerting hegemony and controlling discourse. And we sort of all scoff and we say, oh, no, what about beauty and truth and so forth? And we were right also. But the Marxists were correct in the sense that, yes, public art is a statement of the state's values or the ruler's values. So it used to be the king, it used to be the church, it used to be the local duke, and they would do something to commemorate their father or there was a military victory, so they would commission something like that, or someone would a famous explorer or a sort of a general or a war hero would die in war, and they would be commemorated. And it was an expression of what you valued. And this was very often to do with either things that you achieved. So this would be perhaps you donated almshouses, or you'd given money towards a church, or you'd paid for a town hall to be built. So it was a recognition of the things that you had given to the community, and it was a mark of respect and of thanks. Or it was to do something to do with a sacrifice. So you might have a local person who had died in war, or someone who had been a hero because there'd been a mining accident and they had really gone out of their way to help and had done amazing things. So it's a mark of bravery. Or it was a commemoration for the dead who had served, or any servicemen who had died, or so forth. So it was a recognition of contribution, or it was a mark of respect. Now things are changing. You're seeing statues commissioned to mark representation. And people will actually come out and say this. They will say, this is to do with representation. So we want to have a statue of a black woman in this public space. So there's this artist called Price, and he does sculptures of black people, and they've been placed in places like Rotterdam, outside Rotterdam train station, and then there's another one in Stratford in East London, and then he had a large statue installed temporarily in the piazza, I think it's the main piazza in Florence. So this is right outside the sculpture gallery which holds the sculpture of David by Michelangelo. So it's the heart of sort of Western civilization, the Western Renaissance tradition.
Yeah.
And these are statues of just every man or every woman. They're not known people. They're not people who've done anything. They're not meant to be anyone specific. They are meant to be anonymous. They are meant to be just there as a representation, as making a point that, hey, we are here as well. Okay, well, that's fair enough. There are lots of people like that. There are lots of ethnic minorities who have moved into the West. Fair enough. Why simply just an every person, an every man or an every woman? These are not people who have had great achievements. These are not individuals, not black individuals who have made an achievement. This is just them being there for the sake of being there. And then we get back to the Marxist point. Well, the Marxists had a point about, like, you're only seeing white people because white people were the majority. Now we're seeing black people, and this is an assertion by the state that you are going to have to accept these people, that these people are here as well, that these are really these people are going to be right at the heart of your culture, of your cities, of your cultural areas. And it's a little bit disconcerting when you see that those people are just figures, or perhaps even, uncharitably speaking, tokens. They're not people who have achieved something. So it's a little unsettling to see people being used as tokens in this way. I would say it's disconcerting, and it's not the way that sculpture has been done traditionally up to now. So I think that's something that people need to maybe have a conversation about.
Yeah, because down the road there's, say, a statue of Gandhi, and you can accept that someone who's achieved so many things, there will be a statue of them. But it's more that these people haven't really, they're not known for achieving anything. It's kind of subverting how we've always understood statues as marking a moment of greatness.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is actually what the point, the artist says, that this is meant to be a subversion. It's the idea of making statues to ordinary people rather than statues to great figures. Now, these great figures might have done terrible things, but they are notable people in their own right. I think it's okay to have statues about ordinary people, and that's quite common. But usually it's to do with things that they did. So you have in many sort of towns, you have sort of a weaver or a labourer or a miner, and they're there and they're celebrated for the work that they did.
That industry is important to the town.
Exactly, yeah. But here, these new sculptures by Price are basically just a person wearing ordinary clothes, looking on their mobile phone, and you don't know what job they're doing. You don't know what role they serve in society. Do they serve any role at all? This is not a celebration of the everyman who provides for their family or works a dangerous job or contributes to the well-being of their community. This is just an isolated individual, an atomized individual, and I think that's a peculiar thing to celebrate.
I also wanted to ask you about beauty. You say in the book about ugliness used as a weapon against man. Why is beauty in the world around us, our everyday life, important?
Well, beauty guides how we see ourselves in the world. It allows us to orientate ourselves towards the good. And traditionally in aesthetics, you go back to the schoolmen, the scholars from the medieval period. They said that true art is all about truth, goodness and beauty. There was a sort of a triangle of virtue. And that if you were saying things that were true and also morally good, then they would also be beautiful as well. They would have their own inherent beauty. I think also when you talk about aesthetic beauty, it's really important because it allows us to consider the potential of the world to be beautiful and amazing, and to engage with the world and to be lifted, to have our spirits lifted. There is a movement, I think, to disfigure, I think. You find that there are quite a lot of buildings now that are having rather unsympathetic additions. And sometimes I know that people find this exciting, the mixture of the modern and the old, and I understand that. It is exciting, but I think it's also, there's a degree of spite and a degree of malice. So when you see something beautiful that's old and you see it damaged, in a way that we did with some of the statues being damaged, because there were some quite beautiful statues that were damaged in 2020 in the George Floyd riots that happened principally in America, but also had a knock-on effect in Europe. A lot of those figures, they had an inherent dignity. And when you saw the protesters disfiguring them, painting them up, or scratching them, or even sort of knocking off limbs or knocking off the head, I think it displays an inherent violence and malice and dysfunction in the people who are doing it and the people who encourage it. I think it's unhealthy. I think it's worrying. I think it displays all of our worst characteristics. If you're a religious person, I think you see the sin, you see pride and anger and jealousy and envy and malice coming through when we have this expression of disfigurement, of ugliness. And I do feel sometimes that some architects and some artists, when they do something in a public space and it's deliberately jarring, you do feel this is an expression of their inadequacy and their jealousy. And this is something that we shouldn't be encouraging, and I don't think that we should be commissioning, certainly for public spaces. So if you're a patron and you want this in your gallery or you want this in your landscaped garden, then absolutely go ahead. And if it's your own house, that's also fine. But I think in the public space, it's something not to encourage, because I do think that it's troubling, and I think it reveals some of the least edifying aspects of human nature.
One of the places we're most likely to see beauty is in the buildings. There's been a bit of talk recently about Poundbury, which is the kind of housing area that the king is involved in, and seem to have quite beautiful looking buildings. So why is it beauty important in architecture? How does that affect us?
Well, it's actually, in some ways, it's the most important of the arts. There's some debate about how much of it is an art, because it also has utility. Obviously, it has to house people, it has to protect things, it has to be waterproof, it has to be stable, So there are all sorts of practical things it has to do. But it's an important art form because it's the one that we experienced all the time. We can't get away from it. You can avoid public paintings, more or less. Yeah. You don't have to see them. You don't have to go to the theatre. You don't have to listen to a musical performance. You don't have to do any of those things. But you can't avoid living... Well, most of us, we can't avoid living in at least a town, sometimes a city. We travel through train stations and airports all the time. Even something like a motorway interchange has a degree of aesthetics to it. And this is something that you're seeing every day, and it tells you about who you are and where you are. I've been a little bit sceptical about localism because I see that it's not necessarily the panacea. It's not necessarily the perfect weapon to use against globalism.
So by localism, you mean?
Oh, by localism, I mean using local forms, local materials, following traditions that are applied to your local area. So that might be your region, that might be even your town, or maybe just your country. If you're a small country, you may have a unified style for buildings and so forth. You might even have a sort of a traditional layout of streets and so forth.
So like the Cotswolds, for example, we see that. Right.
Yeah, so that's localism. Now, I've been sceptical about localism in all sorts of ways because I'm not sure that it works perfectly as an antidote to globalism. But one thing it's very, very good at, and one area it's really important, is architecture. So if you're building the Cotswolds, you build in this beautiful yellowish stone And that's so typical of the area. And that's really important, that we don't have sort of glass and steel, that we don't have a sort of an international modernist style being applied everywhere, that we keep some areas with discrete traditions that are sometimes quite old. Some of them are maybe just a century old. They're not that old in terms of the historical overview. But architecture is really important, and I think localism, using local materials, local traditions, local styles, is really important in architecture, and also especially when it's combined with beauty. And we find beauty in something that's appropriate. So we go to the Cotswolds and we go through this sort of lush hills and wooded valleys and so forth, and we see the houses built out of local materials, built at an appropriate scale, built with not too much glass, slate on the roofs, or they've got sort of maybe a different kind of roofing. But you don't see brutalism, you don't see sharp angles, you don't see sort of 5-story buildings. Having that local style and that local language is really important, and I think it's something that connects us to who we are and where we are.
You've mentioned truth several times. What role does truth play in creating art?
Truth is really important because it's also about being true to yourself, being true to your traditions, to the things that you believe in, to your principles. It might also be to your religion. And that requires standing up. It's difficult for artists because they have to speak the truth to themselves, first of all. So I say in the book, how to start a dissident art movement, you start it by telling truths about yourself, about not making compromises with who you are, being honest with other people, saying, no, I don't believe that art should be used as a social tool to promote feminism or whatever the cause is. You have to be honest about yourself, and you have to look deep into yourself about what's important to you. And that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was because it's very easy to talk about dissident movements in terms of funding or galleries or what style of art we should be painting in. It's a lot more difficult to say, I made mistakes. So, for example, this is something I said to you, the phrase that you said of mine that you said you liked was stepping over the culture wars. So that comes from stopping blaming other people. You start to tell the truth about yourself, and you say, I didn't get all of the opportunities that I could have done because of my own mistakes. It wasn't just the director of the so-and-so gallery turning down my exhibition. It wasn't just patron X or local council Y refusing to buy my work. I made some mistakes too.
So you're talking looking inwards rather than blaming others.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So when I talk about, in the book I give some rules for artists, and one of them is to really look into yourself, really consider your own faults, sort yourself out before you start forming a movement and promoting it and inviting people to join you and leading people. Look at what you've done yourself. Look at the mistakes you've made. Look at the way you blame other people. Look at the way you shift blame onto other people. Look at the way you externalize your own faults. So you, for example, you blame politics for the situation you're in rather than your poor business decisions or your poor artistic decisions or being too cautious. If you're cautious, or on the other hand, if you're reckless, you're going to end up in terrible trouble, and that's no one else's fault except for your own. So you have to be truthful to yourself first and foremost before you go out and start any dissident art movements.
And finally, a lot of this we've been talking about is applicable to non-artists, but what would you say to any artists that are watching?
Well, I'd say first of all that the book is a good read for anyone who is an artist or not an artist, because I think there's a lot of things in there that will be useful in your own life, even if you're not a creative person, or you don't think of yourself as a creative person. Because I think a lot of people are creative in their own ways. Like, we were talking about various people who are creative in their own lives, in their homes, in gardening, in clothing, in the way they work in their community and stuff. What I would say to artists is, try and do work that is honest for yourself and not worry about what other people will think. That will include maybe your family members, or also the artists that you're friendly with or admire. Don't paint for them, paint for yourself. Don't seek recognition. Recognition will come to you if you're good enough, also if you're canny enough, if you're sharp enough. But you don't want recognition coming to you when you make false art, because you will be trapped in a style, in an ideology that you do not believe in. You'll be living a lie. Don't live a lie. Make art that's honest, and then start looking outwards.
Alexander Owens, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.